All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. Thanks for tuning into the stream today. It is Tuesday, January 11th of 2022. We've got quite a few questions here in the queue here for today, so should be a pretty good stream. We've got a couple questions about, saving lineups, review mode, a few questions about the simulations themselves, some of the data that you see on step one, min uniques, value, optimal players in Sims, research, all kinds of stuff here. So it should be a pretty fun, diverse stream here. As always, if you've got questions for me, go ahead and pop them into YouTube chat or pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack, and we will get to everything here. I'll go ahead and we're just going to start it off with the last question that came in. This came in yesterday afternoon about bankroll management, contest selection kind of thing. So this was from KB, and he said, when managing bankroll at a 5% max rate per correlated entry, does this apply as a total through all three sites or 5% per site? For example, if my bankroll is 3,000, 5% would be 150. Could I play 150 for basketball on Yahoo, DK, and FanDuel, or should the 150 be split between the three sites? And then secondly, I play another 5% for NHL, same sites. So if 3,000 is your combined total bankroll that you have for DFS across every site, then you would only want to play $150 across every site, theoretically, right? If you have 300 dollars on each site, or $3,000 on each site, then you could theoretically play 150 on every single site. But should be 5% of whatever your total roll is there across all sites. So, but then with hockey, right? Hockey is uncorrelated to your results in NHL on any given night, or uncorrelated to your results in NBA. Definitely fine to play another 5% in NHL there. Just keeping in mind, I think the last time I answered a similar question like this, when we say 5%, the idea here is 5%, provided that you are able to enter that into the best GPP contests that are out there, which is getting as many entries into low entry contests until you move up in stakes, playing as much as you can at $3 and under, playing as much as you can in contests that are over 1,000 effective entrants, right? All of these things to maximize your expected value. In hockey, smaller sport, it's harder to get to some of those contests as easily. So I would be a little bit more cautious, right? I would assume that your theoretical expected value, if you're just building lineups, is probably higher in NBA just because the contests are going to be softer than they are in NHL. I would probably recommend, before just diving right into NHL at 5% per slate, you might consider scaling that back a little bit, letting a sample size of data build up, and seeing, by looking at something like your Roto Tracker, seeing how much edge you have playing the sport. Just because hockey can play a little bit sharper because the contests are smaller, the impact of the NHL DFS grinders that are out there that are really skilled at that particular sport is a lot higher in those particular contests. So, I know there's the $20 $1 or the 20 max $1 hit check or whatever. That's only going to be about 5,000 entrants most nights. Effective entrance is pretty small on that one. Those contests, even under $3, are going to play a lot tougher. So be cautious of that, I would say. But yeah, otherwise, no problem to play multiple, or to play 5% in multiple sports per night. So. Clint said, Jordan, how many cups of coffee in a single day is too much? Ooh, good question. I rarely go over 3. 3 is like a hard max for me, and that doesn't happen too often. Two every day for me is pretty common. Get one first thing, sit down at the desk, start working, you get one right there. And then after maybe an hour or two, you get that second cup. That third cup for me, a lot of times, is an afternoon play. And it's rare. Maybe you don't sleep so well the night before. But I don't go too far beyond 3. So I mix in the occasional Red Bull, maybe on the weekends, but definitely 3 max for me. 3 max coffee. But good question there. Let's keep it going, guys. Let's see here. So this is a good question here Paul said late slate coffee. Yeah, there you go. The afternoon slate. Okay, so this is from Nittany Jen, and he said, sorry if this has been answered before, but does SaberSim save the lineups when you download them? For instance, tonight Seth Curry was in my lineups and he went out. So if I downloaded my lineups from DraftKings/FanDuel, uploaded new entries in SaberSim and redid the process, are they saved now after I filled contests with my new lineups? Currently, I'm always uploading new lineups, even though I haven't made any changes within DraftKings or FanDuel. Just wondering if I'm wasting time or effort. Okay, so if you're talking about the entry editor, we won't, like, nothing's going to change unless you change something, right? So, I guess put another way, if you're late swapping, right? Maybe you put your lineups in at lock and then you're late swapping. You don't need to download a fresh new entries file every single time you late swap, right? It's really only if you're getting errors on the late swap or if you've changed something on the sites, that's when you probably want to do it. But I want to say a couple things on this here before I move on, because there are a few things that you can notice might change. So in a given build, right? This is a build here, right? We're going to get a set of lineups out of this, right? So hold on, let's get this going here. Okay, so we've got our lineups. We're all good here, right? So we're going to save this. This is a lineup set, right? 20 lineups, 12:08:04 p.m., right? Now we go over here. Let's get my entries file for tonight going. Okay. Boom. Good to go there. Okay. So here's the entries file. We can fill this, right? So we won't change this on you, right? This won't suddenly become different than it was before or anything like that. So if you come in here, you can run your late swap, run your build, download those lineups, re-upload. When you come back later, this will be updated to reflect the late swap, right? It'll say late swap here. It'll say the late swap build, etc. You'll be all good there. You don't need to upload a fresh entries file before every single late swap. If you're getting errors when you're doing your late swap, then do that, right? Because something got out of whack somewhere along the lines. One thing that can change is if we run builds or if we run sims later throughout the day. So let's say I wait 3 hours and I come back to this a little after 3 my time. These lineups are probably going to be different. They're probably going to look different because the projections will have changed and the top 20 lineups from this build will be different now. The projections will update to the most recent projections from that sim. Now, this build is never going anywhere. I can always, or not this build, sorry, this lineup set is never going anywhere. I can always go back to this lineup set and say, show me that lineup set, and it'll bring those lineups back. But if I just open up the build, right, and I don't have any lineup set selected or anything like that, just like we saw a second ago, that can change. The default lineups that are showing up when you come back to a build later. But that doesn't have any impact on what's actually in the entries file. It won't automatically start changing the entries file around, right? We don't want to create a situation where people are getting errors or anything like that. So just wanted to show that because I know there have been some questions before of like, I went back to my build from earlier and the lineups now are different. And then yes, that's true. That's intended. We want to update your lineup pools when we have new projections to make them as good as possible. And your lineups that you were looking at earlier will always be saved somewhere up here, right? So, and just another reason why I would say best practice, give these things names when you have the time for it, right? Even if, maybe I'm just looking around, maybe I could just call this my, this is my test 12 p.m. research build. I did this just to see how things were looking at noon, right? And maybe I come back later and I'm like, oh crap, all the lineups have changed. The projections re-updated. Everything looks different, but I want to see what those lineups look like. Well, now I can just load this and get those lineups back. So I know that's not about late swap. I think the original question was more about late swap, but I just wanted to mention that because I think that can trip people up sometimes. I've seen questions about that before. So question about review mode here. Let's go ahead. We'll talk about this. I'll explain what it does. It's not something that I use too often, but we'll talk about what it does here first. So we'll jump back. But Brad says, good deal. I had no idea you can rename them. Yeah, you can rename both the builds and the lineup sets, which I think is super useful for just keeping an eye on everything as you're going through things. So let's go ahead and let's get a build here. We'll do yesterday's slate. We'll talk about review mode, what it does, a couple things that you can look at here that I think are interesting. So All right. Okay. So we've got a little build here. Say these were our lineups from yesterday. And I don't see my review mode. Where's review mode? Am I crazy? Should be like right here. Hold on. Let's go back one other day. Maybe it's not. Huh. Here, let's go back to Friday and maybe we'll just pick a different build here. Give me a sec here. Seems like my computer is running a little slow on me. Do the old hard refresh. See if that helps. Trying to pull up Friday's slate here. All right. What I was hoping is that I would have, yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to reset everything here real quick. Okay, so let's go to our build. Maybe this will work. We'll go to a build that we probably built this build on Friday's office hours. So maybe this will work a little bit better. We'll see what these look like and try to pull up review mode here. But definitely taking our time with it here. Here's review mode. Okay, cool. So we have some weird stuff in here. We have like a projected Rudy Gay here. Let's go ahead. Okay, so finally, review mode. You click this toggle. What is it going to do? It is going to lock the lineups in, right? The 20 lineups that you have that are the top 20 lineups in your pool. It's going to kind of lock those in place and then sort your lineups by the highest actual scoring lineups in your pool, right? It is essentially a way to look at your lineups here the same way you would in an actual contest after it's been completed and see which ones are the highest scoring, right? What is a little bit unique about review mode, what is different than actual scoring, right? So when we do the actual scoring lineup, what it's going to do is it's going to take the entire pool of 500 lineups and sort them by the highest actual scoring, right? So this isn't a lineup that we would have actually played. This was in our pool of 500. It wasn't in our actual pool of 20, right? So review mode really is mostly just a very easy way to see the lineups that you actually played and see what the highest scoring ones were, right? Provided that you're looking at the lineup set that you actually played, right? With NBA, you're going to be late swapping probably throughout the night, right? The original lineup build might not be exactly what you ended up with at the end of the night. It might be easier to go to the actual final late swap build and look at those lineups, but that's kind of what they do here, right? I haven't used at review mode too much. I think it's just as easy to go just look on the actual site and see how your lineups ended up doing. I think it's really easy on DraftKings to do that. I do think it's a little bit harder to just go see how your lineups actually performed on both Yahoo and FanDuel. So I think review mode can be a little bit more useful for that. But I just typically end up doing it on the site directly. I do think the actual scoring sort is interesting. One thing I have done a little bit in the past, just to judge how my process is working, is I will look at the actual score here, sort lineups by actual score, which is the entire pool of 500, and then compare that to my expectation of top 1% scoring lineups, right? So if you have 500 lineups in your pool, your expectation is that 5% would score in the top 1%, right? You can kind of get an idea that regardless of how your 20 lineups you actually played, how is your approach to the slate overall by looking how your lineup equity compares to that expectation, right? You probably, if you had 10 lineups in the top 1%, or that would have been in the top 1% based on actual score in your pool of 500, even if you had a bad slate with your top 20, you probably would have outperformed your expectation over the long term based on the lineups that were actually in your pool. I've experimented with that a little bit in the past, especially for baseball. I've done that kind of research a little bit more, just because I think there can be quite a bit more variance of what is in your pool versus what actually makes it into your top 20 or top 150. So I've experimented with that a lot more. But yeah, I mean, both the tools I think are most useful just for, taking a look back at the lineups that you actually played here. how the slate went from different ways of looking at it here. The one thing I would caution anybody on here, I guess, really, is that if you're going to spend some time looking at your past results, which I think is a good idea, I think that's a good use of time, I would try to not get too tunnel visioned onto one particular slate. I think sometimes I can see people kind of start to reverse engineer lineups and using review mode and saying, oh, if I had gotten this lineup in the pool, I would have won the contest or had a top 5 finish. And this is the exposure settings I needed these are the buttons I needed to press to get that lineup in the pool. So now going forward, I'm going to press the same buttons, right? I'm going to remove certain stack sizes. I'm going to only pick lineups with a certain ownership, right? And in reality, like, there's a lot of luck and just like pure randomness that comes into what the actual highest scoring lineup is. So I would say, I think studying your lineups and kind of looking at how your pool performed and how your lineups performed overall, and maybe, did your adjustments take you in a direction that got you closer versus further away, or were the assumptions that you were making to make your adjustments, did those work out correctly? I think all that's good. I would definitely be careful tunneling too hard on what are the buttons to press to have gotten the highest scoring lineup in the top 20, because all you're going to end up doing is optimizing for one particular slate. And there's not much to learn out of that, right? We could sit here probably for the next hour and figure out exactly how to get this lineup into the top 20 by sorting it just by going back to SaberScore. And then all we would have really done is mastered how to have perfectly played the January 7th of 2022 slate, which is never going to happen again. So that's the one point of caution I would make there. But that is what these things do. I think maybe the question was a little bit more about like what these things are and what the difference between review mode and actual score sorting actually is. And that's how they work. So, okay. And then another question from KG here. He said, are the averages based on the Sims? That is rebounds, minutes, steals. Are these averages from the Sims and projected for that player tonight? Yes, they are. Easy answer to that one. Let's go ahead and get back to today. All of the detailed projections you see are the average outcome across the entire set of Sims we have for the game. So, 25.22 points for Nikola Jokic, right? That is his average points scored across every sim we have for the game tonight. Just like the projection is. Right? So, good question. Oops. Okay. And then cool question about min uniques here from AJ. He said, read something from Osimo concerning unique players, and apparently he recommends using anywhere from 2 to 5, depending on the slate size. Save all my initial builds in SaberSim, so last night I was bored and went through the last 2 weeks of NBA and NFL, and came to the conclusion that as a general rule, using uniques seem to provide more diversity and better scoring lineups. I noticed SaberSim does give us the option to tweak this, but I never used it. My focus was more on tweaking projections and exposures to get varied lineups. I am now seriously considering incorporating uniques into my process. I wanted to get your thoughts on it, or whether or not you ever use the feature, or how you think it might be used most effectively. The only drawback is it seems to make the build slower, but that is expected as it makes it work more. Yeah, so good question. So first of all, just to be clear, we're talking about this min uniques in the build settings here, right? So this is the number of unique players you have per lineup. You have to have one. One is the default value here. If you have 2, you're going to force the builder to make sure that there are 2 players different if you compare any 2 lineups in the pool. What this is, and I think you've come to the right conclusion here, this is a blunt force way of making your lineups more diversified, right? It is basically forcing the builder to kind of diversify the lineups based on the individual construction of each lineup. Right. The reason I say it's a blunt force diversification method is because, I'm kind of directly comparing it to sim variance, right? Sim variance is also going to diversify your lineups, right? The way sim variance works is it is going to diversify by looking at a smaller bucket of simulations, right? It essentially widens the range of outcomes for players. So similar, but better than like something like a randomness that you might see on a different optimizer, right? We look at a wider range of outcomes for each individual player when we're building each individual lineup, which diversifies your lineups. But because we're using the real ranges of outcomes of players, we're diversifying in a way that also potentially increases the upside of the lineups, right? The min uniques option here diversifies but doesn't really have that same effect. In reality, what we're actually doing is we're just going through looking at the same initial pool of lineups and making sure, comparing. The reason why the builder takes longer is we're comparing each lineup to every other lineup in the pool and making sure that it fits the rule, right? That's what's actually happening here. I don't think there's anything wrong with increasing your min uniques. It isn't going to increase the expected value of your lineups. I would say that. It does not surprise me that if you're going through and looking at the last couple weeks of data and then turning up the min unique slider and running builds, that you are seeing that there are higher overall scoring lineups in the pool when you do that, because you are forcing the builder to diversify, right? You are just in the same way, if you crank sim variance up and then back tested an entire season, you would probably see that the builds that you ran with sim variance at a very high value are more likely to have one or a minority or a very small amount of extremely higher scoring lineups, right? Because you are forcing the builder to get away from just the best overall projected plays, right? You are forcing diversity in there. You're forcing volatility in there. So it makes sense that when you reach in and look for how can I generate the one highest scoring lineup possible, anything you do to diversify is going to increase the chance that you're getting that one highest scoring lineup. But I don't think this doesn't necessarily make the lineups from an expected value standpoint better. These lineups are probably not more profitable over the long term, right? Because you're also going to diversify in the other direction, right? You probably have lower, when you're forcing the builder to do things that are more varied, right? You get a wider pool of exposures and lineup types in your pool, right? You are going to probably get more lineups on the high side. You also are probably going to get more lineups on the low side. When your lineups are less variant overall, you're going to get lineups that are a little bit more condensed and finish more closely all around the same position. All of this to say, there's certainly nothing wrong with using it. It will force additional diversification into your lineups, and it will do so without considering, higher variance range of outcomes for players, right? So I do think there is an argument to be made, right? Like maybe you're playing lower variance contest types, right? Maybe you're playing a lower variance sport like NBA. You're playing lower variance contest types where you want to diversify your pool a little bit more, right? Maybe you're playing something like this, where you want to diversify your pool a little bit more, but you don't want to do so in a way that is increasing the range of outcomes, the sim variance that we're using for each individual lineup. I think doing something like this is perfectly fine. Since the question directly says, do I use it? The answer is no. I've actually never touched it once. I've used it to test it when we were delivering the feature, but I'm generally pretty happy with the amount of diversity I get in my lineups just with sim variance alone. And it's just never been something that I've felt the need for. It does not surprise me that Osimo says something to the effect of using 2 to 5 min unique players depending on the slate or slate size, because this is definitely very much a setting that to me is not something that I would say is there's a right answer to this. I wouldn't say, your min unique should be 2 or should be 3, right? I would say what probably makes more sense if I were to use this would be to do it on a slate by slate basis, compare my lineups, and potentially on slates where I was seeing a very heavy concentration of maybe a certain core or a certain combination of players. Maybe at that point I would increase this to 2 or 3 or so in order to force diversification on a slate where I wasn't getting a lot naturally. So the other thing too is, frankly, there is no sim variance on other optimizers, right? There isn't a tool to introduce diversity in as sophisticated and as robust as a way as we can. So your reliance on things like min uniques and other tools like randomness has to go up. But Steve said, would you lower your variance if you crank up uniques? I wouldn't, because at that point, then we're using, that actually could potentially start lowering your expected value, right? At that point, because what's going to happen then is we're using a bigger bucket of sims for each individual lineup. Your lineups themselves, the actual lineup constructions themselves, are going to be a little less variant. They're going to take less shots, right? Those lineups are probably going to start to have higher min cash equity than top 1% equity and things like that, right? The min uniques isn't really going to affect, I'm trying to think about the right way to say this. It doesn't affect the expected value of the lineups, because essentially the way that this is applied is it changes the way that lineups are selected, right? So there are, when you are building lineups with SaberSim, there is the lineups you actually get, right? This is your top 20. There are the lineups in your pool. I'm realizing my camera's not really pointing at me here. There are the lineups in your pool, right? Which are the lineups you can sort through as you're dialing in exposures on step 3. But then there's also like a much broader pool of lineups that don't make the cut that exist here, right? And that's kind of the way that the min-unique slot, that's kind of the way that the min-unique setting works, right? Is that when you crank this to 2, we're actually, and you have 500 here, we're actually probably building more than 500 individual lineups. And there are certain lineups that get eliminated because they don't have at least 2 uniques from other lineups in the pool, right? So you're basically kind of, you're changing the selection process of lineups. You're not changing the actual lineup construction. But if you do this, you are changing the rules that control the way the lineups are built. And that I would say that has the potential to lower your expected value or lower your upside if you started doing that. Good rule of thumb in general, I've said this question has come in multiple different ways, is I would probably never change your sliders as a result of a different setting you are setting here, right? Or in stacking, right? Another common question. I set a stack rule in NFL. Should I turn down my correlation? The answer to that is always no, because the correlation slider is going to make sure that you help get the most correlated players in those stacks, right? Another question. I've curated my player pool and I'm fully fading some of the chalkier players on the slate. Should I turn down ownership fade? I would say probably no, because ownership fade is going to help that make sure that for the remaining players in your player pool, that the lineups that get built with those players still have the right amount of ownership for the contest you're playing. And I would say the same question applies here, right? I'm forcing additional diversity into my pool with mid-unique. Should I turn down variance? I would say no, because we still want to make sure we're considering the right amount of simulations for the contest you're playing. So, David said, if you built lineups with min-uniques at 2, does that remain in place with late swap? It should. I actually think one thing to look at, I think it will remain in place for other builds as well. So, like, just keep an eye out for that. Like, if you go in here and change this to 2 and run a build, your default the next time you pull this up will probably say 2 here. But the option is still here in late swap builds, so I would just keep an eye out for it there, and make sure that it's still set. This can also take this can make the builder take a little bit longer to build. Just so you guys know, I wouldn't ever increase this beyond 3. I think 3 is probably like the max I would go with this. If you're going beyond 3, you're really forcing quite a bit of diversification into the pool at that point. It's probably unnecessary. It's probably just kind of spinning your wheels at that point. So, but good questions. Cool. I'm going to move us along. Really good question there. And then another one here. So this actually, what's funny about this is also from AJ. And I actually think the answer to this question is also weirdly similar, even though the topic is the very different. So this question's about value. He said, I've also played around with the idea of a value score to narrow down my pool of players used in builds. For example, if a $3,000 player in NBA is projected for 20 points, that's expected point per dollar value of 6.67. My method multiplies the 6.67 times the projected points of 20 for an approximate value score of 133. This is my way of trying to compensate for the fact that not all value is created equal based off a player's salary. I then can use this to eliminate all players below a certain threshold. Wanted to get your opinion as to what thoughts and opinions as to whether or not you think this can be a viable way of narrowing down the pool with the most potential. So what's interesting about this is, the reason why I think this question is interesting, especially following the last one, is because this is also something that I think sim variance kind of accounts for in a way that is more sophisticated than doing this, right? What's happening every single time we build a lineup with sim variance here is we're taking a random set of sims and we're taking the actual points that those players scored in that sim and then building the best possible lineup around that, taking into account ownership fade and correlation there. But because we're actually looking at the ranges of outcomes of players, right? The only players that are going to get put in the lineups are the ones that had a, particularly efficient point scoring output in that set of sims compared to their salary, right? So like the the builder is in some ways doing this for you, but rather than trying to make some computation based on the average, it's doing it on each individual set of sims each time a lineup is made, right? So when you're actually getting a player in the lineup, it's not kind of pure luck. It's that player in that set of sims was optimal for their price. So I would say this. I think you are thinking about this in a good way, right? The problem with value, well, there's a couple problems with value, but a big one, first of all, is that it's taken across an average, right? And we don't really care about what happens at the average for most players to win GPPs, right? But the second problem is that it's not adjusted for salary, right? And you are exactly right. 5x value means something very different when you're talking about a 3K player versus a 12K player, right? So I think you were thinking about that the right way. I do think that this may be a little bit redundant because SimVariance does a lot of this for you, right? The pool of players that you end up with if you build 20 lineups, right? Your de facto player pool is essentially a set of players for whom they were optimal in a certain set of sims appropriate to the contest you're playing. And you'll get a certain player pool that's appropriate for a 150 max contest and a certain player pool that's appropriate for a 20 max contest. And this kind of actually happens naturally when you are building the lineups. I do think what this probably does is it probably diversifies you. I think this probably makes that you're playing a little bit more uniquely compared to maybe other players out there. I think, but personally, I think that a lot of this is already being automated for you in the way that SimVariance works, right? Is my initial impression here. I have done something similar. I wasn't using this multiplier calculation. I was using a target score type approach with a linear addition. So I was saying basically that a player needs to score, I think it was 5x plus 10 points, or I think it might have been, let me think about this. I think it was 6x plus 10 to be viable, right? And I was doing this for a long time. This was years ago, and I just felt like it didn't really add anything and was so dependent on the contest I was playing that I ended up dropping it. Because again, I think looking at the real ranges of outcomes we have for players in a particular set of simulations we have for the game is just a better approach to creating that player pool that you actually end up walking into the contest with. And that happens automatically for you. So, but I'm not the arbiter of truth with these things. I'd be happy to talk about this a little bit more because it's something I've experimented with back and forth. So, I mean, AJ, if you have more thoughts on it, feel free to share. That's kind of I think both of your questions here have been kind of like, what do you think about this? And that's kind of my gut take on this. But I think there is, I think you are still probably thinking at least about the value the right way here. So, okay, cool. Lots of questions coming in. That's all. We will get to everything. I promise. I'm going to keep going through the questions that came in before the start of the stream. This one is from Reed. And he said, is there a way for NFL Showdown Sims to get the percentage chance that a particular captain player ends up in the optimal lineup? Another way of asking, 20 to 150 selected Sims are going to be way all over the place for captain exposure. I'm looking for a more smooth percentage. Yeah, so what you want to do, and I think this was discussed a little bit in Slack, is run a 0-0-10 build and include the maximum amount of lineups as possible, which is 1,500. So we will look. Let's see if we have on Tuesday. We may not have NFL projections yet, but we can certainly check. Doesn't look like it. Okay, maybe we can let's use week 18s. We'll go backwards here. And let's take the Sunday night football game. Okay. So you can approximate this, right? This is not a perfect mathematical computation, right? We're not looking at the entire set of sims for the game, but you can approximate this by running a build at 0-0-10, right? So you're going to say, give me the optimal for a randomly selected sim 1,500 times. Probably a good idea to change this back to 50,000, right? It's 49.9 to drop to lower your chance of being duplicated when you're building real lineups. But since this is purely for research, we're not super worried about that. And this is probably the most important thing. And I think the point that maybe wasn't getting across clearly in Slack is you need this to be 1,500 as well, right? If you're seeing a lot of diversity each time you run a build, a ton of diversity, it's probably because you're not changing the number of lineups that you're actually looking at. So now if we run this, we will get what I think can be used to approximate the percent chance of a certain player showing up in the optimal lineup. There will still be variation if you run this build to build to build, right? Because maybe there's 10,000 sims of this game, right? And when we randomly take a bucket of 1,500 each time, we're going to get a random bucket of that. But it's a pretty good approximation for this. With as much variance as there is in the projections of players themselves, with as much variance as there is in ownership projections of players for a showdown slate, I would not worry about the little bit of variance that you are going to get of what the captain exposure is in your research build, right? There's enough variance in these other things that you are probably comparing this number to anyway, that if you run this and one time you get 11% and one time you get 15%, and one time you get 10%, right? I wouldn't sweat that as much because there's a ton of variance in this number. There's a ton of variance even in this number, right? So, yeah, there's the natural variance that you're getting when you bucket your 1,500 sims is probably just kind of, part of that. So, but that's the easiest way to do that. And this is the spirit of my research builds, which I've talked about a lot, right? The idea here being that we can approximate the percent chance of a player showing up in the winning lineup by looking at how often they show up in a lineup in a 0-0-10 build. And this works very well on sports where the percent chance of a player being in the optimal is close to the percent chance of the player being in the winning lineup for a contest. And there is no better example of that than NFL Showdown. So, works pretty well for NFL Showdown for sure. Okay, question from Scott here. Does SaberSim run Sims for PGA? I never see when they have be run in the Slack channel. I thought you mentioned Sims being run during yesterday's stream, but I thought you only provided projections. No, we have simulations for golf. I don't know what happened. I don't know if the lineup alerts for golf were ever working in Slack, to be completely honest. I assume they had to have been at one point. Otherwise, it's basically just a channel that just exists to tweet out the Fantasy Labs PGA Twitter account, which isn't great anyway. But we do have Sims. You can see that we have Sims. If you click on a player, you can actually see the ranges of outcomes of the golfer, right? So these are actual simulations, which I think is a big value add because golf is binary, right? We have the golfer misses the cut ranges of outcomes, and then the golfer makes the cut ranges of outcomes, right? And other DFS players playing DFS golf using something like randomness or other tools to diversify lineups are going to make an assumption that a golfer is normally distributed, and they very much are not. So it doesn't work very well. So we do have Sims. I don't know why there are not alerts. I don't know. Well, I don't really know why there isn't a timestamp up here. I'll tell you this. For golf, there typically are not a lot of updates throughout the week that are changing the projections. So an initial projection run will pop up here early in the week. Typically, I would say by about Tuesday, these projections are up here, and they typically are not going to change much throughout the week. Even Bryson has withdrawn from this. That doesn't, all the golfers are pretty much independent events, right? That's why there's very little correlation in golf. It doesn't even really affect anything if a golfer has withdrawn from the tournament, right? It affects your lineups. You don't want that guy in your lineups, but the projections for an individual golfer and what we are expecting that golfer to do in the particular event doesn't really change after we simulate the first sims for it. So at that point, they basically stay pretty constant. There are not ensuing sims. I would say if you are interested in to start building your golf lineups, you can start as early as now because it is unlikely that this changes. A couple notes with that, right? Or things that I see as coming up as common questions is, does ownership change throughout the week, right? The answer is not really. Our ownership model is basically just an algorithm that is using an industry aggregate projection, building a ton of lineups at very high variance, and using the exposure to certain golfers to generate the ownership projections for the slate, right? Ownership will change throughout the week if you look elsewhere because there is steam, there are touts, there's a lot of positive feedback loops that happen throughout the week related to golf, right? Certain golfers become more popular purely because people are talking about them. If you can pick up on that, that can be a value add to the ownership projections, right? I don't even know who's likely to be chalky this week at the moment, but maybe everybody's talking Cam Smith up again. Maybe people go back to Sung Jae. I don't know, right? But maybe you're seeing that there's a guy that looks under projected by the time that the event is about to start on Thursday. Bump up their ownership projection because the model isn't going to know that everybody was talking about that guy. It's purely just an algorithmic. Here's the projections, and here's what we think that golfer is going to be owned. The other thing is weather, right? At the moment, the model does not take into account weather and tee times. So we won't update projections throughout the week when tee times come out. And also, like, if in the morning wave or something like that, there's a ton of wind, right? That kind of thing is not going to be adjusted here. If you've got a read on that, you can make adjustments as well. I think that can be another sharp place to make adjustments. But long story short, the sims do run. There are sims powering the golf model, which I think is really powerful, but it typically just kind of one and done runs once. So good question there. Okay. Banami here. MLB question. Wow. All right. I got to start writing down when I get the first MLB question. This might be the first MLB question of the year here. But he said last year started rough for a lot of people and improved over time. Has there been any adjustments to mitigate that, or does baseball have too much variance? Baseball has a ton of variance. All sports, all GPPs have a ton of variance in your actual results. I can't necessarily speak to why you may have had a rough start to the year. I will say that we will be turning our attention to baseball on the model sides here pretty quickly. It is getting to be about that time, especially as February comes around. It starts to become a focus for us. So all of our sports, as we head into the start of the season, get some attention. There is pretty much always updates to the sims and models for all sports, at least especially for the three big ones, the three major sports, football, basketball, and baseball. I know my hockey fans and maybe my golf fans are lamenting right now that I didn't include those in those lists, but those three sports are definitely our three biggest. And those three, there's always kind of a yearly update to the sims, to the models for football, basketball, and baseball before the start of every season. So long story short, yes, there will be updates. So, all right, let's keep it going. I'm going to hit this real quick. So Reed mentioned that when he did a research build, he ran it twice and Keenan went from 25% to 0%. Let's see. I'm curious if I can see something, if I can get a similar result. Let's go back here. That feels, I don't know. Let's see. Let me see what I get. So we just ran one, right? And we had, who did we get up here at the top? We had like Herbert. Where's the build? There we go. We had Herbert and Josh Jacobs and Eckler, all like 13-ish%, right? So let's see. Okay. Let me snap a screenshot of this here and we'll compare. Okay. So let's try another one here and see what we get. running a little science experiment here. There is going to be some natural variance here. I'm curious how much we get here. I think 25 to 0% sounds like a lot to me. But let's see. I think, well, let me stop talking and just let the build finish, right? Okay. So let's see. So in the first build, Austin Eckler was 13.2. Now he's 14.1. Keenan Allen was 10.7. Now he's 13.5. Herbert was 13.3. Now he's 12.5. So approximately the same. Reed, what it sounds like is probably happening to me or happening to you is that this number up here is 20 or 150, or you're not actually looking at the entire pool, the entire 1500 lineup set. So it's very important that you're changing this number to 1500 and looking at the entire pool, because there's going to be a ton of variance when you're just looking at the top 20 or top 10 or top 150. You need to look at the entire pool of 1500 when you're comparing these research builds together, and then you should see some more consistency in these numbers. They're still not going to be the exact same every build, but they're going to be a lot closer. So I would try that. Make sure that this is saying 1500. So, okay. So then also said my subscription. So Reed says my subscription level only shows 20 lineups. Is that the issue? Yeah. So this looking at your entire pool of 1500 lineups like this is something that you can only do on the advanced plan. This is, I would also say, to be, completely honest, this is probably more of an advanced strategy, right? The starter plan, you're limited to 20 lineups and you can't view your whole pool to do things like this. You've got to get onto the advanced plan to look at all 1500 here. So that probably explains what's going on there. But okay. Let's see. Question from a meme. I assume that's how that's pronounced. Let me know if it isn't. Does entry limit need to be adjusted for contests where the vast majority aren't maxing? The entry limit should... No, I wouldn't. The entry limit should just match whatever the realistic entry limit is of the contest, right? I mean, I guess I could say this. If you've got a read on, like, how many entries the people in the contest are actually going to play in a particular contest, and you want to make an adjustment there, I think that's fine. The only situation I could probably see that in is like a smaller stakes or a higher stakes, smaller field contest, right? Where like maybe it's a 20 max as it's written, but it's a, I don't know, $600 to enter contest or $1,500 to enter contest, and you think that it's more likely that most people play 6 lineups, right? Maybe you use the 3 max settings instead. It's only going to create a minor variation here at all in the actual sliders there. I think it's far more easier to just take the written entry limit and just use that. Actually, in fact, now that I'm talking through this, I would say just use the actual posted entry limit for the contest. The reason why is because when we backtest this, we backtest the settings that are optimal to the contests for what their entry limit is posted in, not what the average entries per user actually is for the contest, right? So when we're backtesting and creating the 20 max sliders, we're comparing what sliders generate the lineups that perform the best in contests that say they are 20 max, not what lineups do the best in contests where the average lineup per person is closest to 20, right? Does that make sense? So just use the entry limit. When you're setting your sliders, just use the entry limit that is actually the posted entry limit of the contest. But good question. I think that's the first time I've ever actually answered that one. So good question. Okay. Joseph, first of all, said, is that a ponytail or a man bun? I got the mane down today just for you, Joseph. So me, especially when me and Max are on here together, we've got a lot of flowing hair flying around. So, but Joseph said, can you talk about some of the research you do that determines how you dial in, be it ownership, changing projections up or down, etc., as well as what sources you are using? Yeah, this is a common question here as well. I'm going to be completely honest, especially with NBA, there's not a lot of adjustments I'm making to projections for NBA, first of all. Like, I think the NBA model is extremely good. And I think there's a more interesting edge in just late swapping to get more accurate information in a way that the field isn't going to do in NBA. That's like 90% of my strategy for NBA. For other sports like NFL and baseball, I think it is more interesting in general for me, the way I approach the game, right? I think it is more interesting to find ownership inefficiencies and play a game theory game than try to improve upon the model itself. And I think that's just the way that my strategy ends up working out. I think that's the way I think about DFS, is that I am less interested, and I am probably just frankly less skilled at looking at player projections and figuring out situations and game states that the model isn't taking into account. I am more skilled at finding situations where I think the ownership is inefficient on a certain player. And the way I do that, and I've talked about that at length, is doing things, not so much for NBA, but doing things like research builds to figure out how likely a player is to be optimal and comparing that to the ownership projections and things like that. The adjustments I make to ownership a lot of times come as a part of that. It's less about me necessarily going to a particular place and doing research, and more about, being plugged into DFS Twitter and YouTube. I've mentioned before, for football, I listen to guys like Al Zeidenfield and Joe Holka and Sal Vetri and kind of think about, what does the field think? How does the field thinking about this game? And when I go in and run my research build, so let's do one for week 18 real quick here and talk about like kind of what I'm doing here. Hang on, we'll give this a second to come up. And week 18 was weird anyway, but we'll do this anyway. So, okay. So we're running a research build for this past weekend, right? And when I'm comparing, so first of all, while this is building, I'll mention, I've talked about like this process and what my NFL process looks like in more detail in this video on our YouTube channel, the end of the NFL course, right? Crush NFL DFS 2021 course, the last lesson here. Building high upside NFL DFS lineups with SaberSim. This is an hour-long video of my NFL process. So one of the things I talk a lot about in that video is the research build process, which is running this build, right, and comparing a percent chance of a player being in the optimal lineup with their ownership projection, right? This kind of goes both ways for me personally, right? I'm looking at a player and basically saying, if this player is this owned, right, then they are inefficiently owned. The field is inefficiently under-owning or over-owning the player, right? Sometimes the answer to that question there, or that inefficiency, is, okay, I'm going to be overweight on that player. Other times it's, okay, the ownership projection is probably wrong, right? Player X has a 40% chance to be in the optimal lineup, and the ownership projection says 15%, right? Is there 25% of inefficiency by the field on that particular player? Maybe, but probably my initial impression would be that ownership projection is actually going to be a little bit higher, right? SaberSim's NFL model is very good. If this model thinks that this player is that well projected, it is likely that other models are as well, and that the ownership projection just isn't picking up on this particular situation. So there are times where throughout the week I will see a certain player getting kind of steamed, or a lot of conversation about a certain player, and I have a sense that a player is going to be chalky. But the way that I actually end up adjusting the ownership projections kind of comes out a little bit more naturally as a part of this overall process, rather than being this like unique individual step of the process, right? So I'm trying to come up with a good example, right? I notice it more on the positive leverage plays, right? But an example that is popping out to me right now is Josh Allen, right? So this was our best overall positive leverage play running this research build, right? We see Josh Allen showing up in 11% of optimals, only projected at 3% owned. If we go and look at the ownership projections, right? So, so this is a perfect example. This is where I would kind of start to look at this. Do I really think that the field is going to get to Matt Stafford as the overwhelmingly best QB option on the slate, followed by Kyler Murray and Kirk Cousins, then Andy Dalton, right? Like that to me kind of feels a little intuitively wrong for how the way I think the slate was going to play. And it would have been a situation that rather than saying, that Josh Allen is going to be 8% inefficiently underowned at QB, I would say that his ownership projection actually is probably going to come in a little bit closer to 11%. And that would be a player I would adjust. And this comes out naturally throughout my process rather than looking and going to a particular source and saying, I calculate ownership projections based on this, right? And it's not something I'm doing for every single player on the slate. I mentioned that before too, right? It's sometimes just a couple players that I think are the right, like, put another way, if Josh Allen is going to be 8 percentage points underowned, either I need to be over on him or this number's wrong, is essentially what what my process says. And the same thing, you can look at it the other direction too. If we go to the leverage, the negative leverage, right? Like either Stafford's ownership projection is wrong or I'm going to be well under him, right? In this case, I think this is a little high. This number doesn't look that wrong to me. That kind of feels about right for what my expectation was here of James Conner's ownership, right? So in that case, I'd be probably under on Conner. And this is just kind of my approach. And I realize there is a little bit, I wish I could say that I'm doing this in a way that is entirely methodical and that you could just follow the steps of this. And there isn't. Like some of this has a bit of an intuitive feel. And sometimes I'm wrong. There are situations where I just don't have the right read on a player and he is far less or far more chalky than I expected, right? But that's kind of the way I approach this. If you are interested in, for particularly on the NBA side, watching the process of somebody who does do a lot more external research and goes to specific other sources here and dials in projections and finds where the projections might be missing something, I would watch Max's most recent video here that he did for us. Did this about a month ago. How to beat daily fantasy basketball like an NBA DFS pro. So Max does something that is just frankly very different than what I do with NBA. I think it's really cool. I think it's really interesting. And he actually goes in and looks at rotations on Popcorn Machine. He stays up to date with the news just like I do, but studies the actual individual rotations and also certain statistics like usage and how teams play when players are missing on the basketball court, right? How do the Hawks play when Trae Young isn't out there, and makes adjustments to the projections on the app. And that diversifies him. That makes him somewhat more contrarian than other players. And that kind of is the way that he gets a lot of his edge. I think there are other older videos as well on here too. Let me look. Okay. So if you go to playlists, okay, so there are a couple older videos here in these playlists. If you go to playlists on our YouTube channel, these are from a couple seasons ago. This is before I was a part of the team here. But these videos too, adjusting projections, advanced NFL DFS strategy, adjusting projections. These are all videos by Max and Danny, and they have an approach that is far more focused on making adjustments to projections and kind of finding inefficiencies in the actual model themselves and making their adjustments there. So I'd check that out. I know that maybe this isn't the ideal answer that you were looking for here, but I'm just being totally transparent. It has always been my approach to DFS that I think it's easier to assume that the model is taking into account the most important factors and to play in a way that is a bit more maybe exploitative and try to figure out where the field is going to be inefficient. And that's been my approach. So really good question. I'll follow up here too. So put me on the spot today. Joseph said a lower SaberScore is less. Okay, regarding lineup pool, a lower SaberScore is less strong than a higher one, but is it still viable? Do you care about it after you dial it in? If 5, 10, 20 plus lineups are on the back end of your entire pool, okay. I guess the question kind of just dials off or tails off there. I get what you're asking though. And Joseph followed this up by saying, I'm going to tinker with adding my highest SaberScore, low ownership lineups, many of which are toward the middle / back end of the lineup pool. It is a good question, right? I always say this, right? Your entire pool of lineups are viable, but the highest SaberScore lineups are the best ones, right? Where's the rub there? Where's the difference? There's not a good answer to that. If we knew, for example, that all lineups under a 90 SaberScore were no good, we wouldn't give them to people, right? So there's not a clear answer to this. The answer is kind of both. I would never necessarily say that you shouldn't play a lineup that was given to you by the builder purely because of the SaberScore of that lineup, right? Because exactly as I just said, we would not have built that lineup for you, right? That would be something that we would automate for you if that was something that we could kind of suss out. However, there is a spectrum to the quality of lineups, right? A 100 SaberScore lineup is not going to theoretically have the same EV as an 80 SaberScore lineup. I think the best advice I can give you here is to utilize the full SaberSim process, right? The more you are putting in changes that you want to make in steps 1 and step 2, the higher quality the pool of lineups is going to be in step 3. For example, if you know that you are unwilling to play any NFL lineup that doesn't at least have a QB plus 2 stack, if you just build lineups with no stacking rule and just then remove every lineup that doesn't have a QB plus 2, you are immediately going to start playing lineups that have a lower overall SaberScore. There are going to be lineups that are worse in the pool. Purely by the process of elimination, you're going to have a less quality pool of lineups to work from. Since you know that you want that lineup specification beforehand, set the rule as a SaberScore beforehand, right? And then build it. And then your entire pool of 1,500 lineups already has the rule in place. So you're getting the best lineups out of that. Same thing. Let's say you have a player pool that you are unwilling to use any players that are outside of that player pool, and you also have 2 players that are locked. You could run a build with no player pool specifications, no locked players, and then in step 3, lock those players in and remove the players that are in the pool. But what you are going to do is just then eliminate a ton of lineups, and your average SaberScore of the lineups that you actually play is going to be lower, right? I think that probably means you're playing worse lineups. I think in that case, you should instead set that in step 1 so that we're building a pool of your lineups that is better. If you watch this show regularly, I'm sure you're thinking, wait, Jordan, you always say, isn't it better to do things on step 3? I think in this particular case, it makes sense to do a test build where you don't set any rules and then see in step 3 how flexible is the builder to these sorts of things, right? How much does SaberSim by default like my core, right? How many am I getting 90% exposure to a player that I was planning on just eliminating? I should maybe take another look at that guy. Am I getting 0% exposure to a guy that I thought was a lock? Maybe I should rethink that. Running an initial test build with no settings and no player pool changes allows you to just see what the builder, what SaberSim kind of thinks of the slate. But if you're going to end up ultimately making changes, and you know for a fact that you're going to be making some of these changes, you should do them in step 1 so that the quality of your pool in step 3 is better. And that's kind of what I mean of utilize the entire process. It will, if you use the tools that are available to you across steps 1, 2, and 3, the resulting lineups that you get out will be a higher quality. And that's reflected in the average SaberScore of the lineups that you end up playing with. But I do still believe that any lineup that we're building for you is viable for the contest. I would not eliminate a lineup purely based on its SaberScore. So, really good question. That's another one that I don't think I've gotten asked of me before. So, good question. And I know there's kind of a few different things going on there with that particular topic. So if anybody has any questions, let me know. Kind of definitely gets into the nuance of process with SaberSim. So, okay. Woo. I was kind of a long answer. But let's keep it going. There are a ton of questions today. This is great. Chris said, am I able to max enter 150 GPP from my app on my phone? Yeah, you certainly are. In fact, I think there's probably no tool that makes it easier, right? Let's do this. Let's go to NBA and let's do mobile view. So this is your phone, right? Build lineups, 150, set the sliders, start new build. We spent a ton of time this past fall mobile optimizing this new version of the app. The old classic version was not really a great mobile experience. This version is much, much better. So looking good, right? Lineups. Oh, we have to make 2 changes to see the lineups. No problem. We can do that. And I'm using a computer here, so the controls are a little wonky because it thinks it's on a phone, and it's not. But we'll make 2 changes there. Boom. Lineups. You can do everything you can here anyway, right? Look at the lineups. You can set exposures, whatever. We're feeling good. Best part is entry editor on the phone is just a lifesaver. It's so nice. The one thing is that you can't upload these entries files. If you've used your phone before, you know this, but you can't upload these entries files to the app. You have to do this on the mobile site. But fill, right? 150 lineups, apply, download and open DraftKings. Does this here? We'll even open up the mobile version of this so we can see. So this will open up DraftKings, which doesn't look like they even really have much of a mobile optimized version of the site, but you can click the upload. This will obviously look different too since I'm doing it on my computer, but it's super easy. It's really, I really don't know of any tool that does this easier than we do, to be completely honest. I know I'm coming at that from a biased standpoint, but I'm serious. I don't think there's anything that is easier. The fact that you can, do this without having to open a CSV file on your phone in like Google Sheets or something is just huge. If you've ever had to do that, it sucks. It really does. And this streamlines it significantly. So, all right. Let's see. Clint says, Jordan, I was on a trial last week. How did I get so much Stanley Morgan and Samaj P. Ryan for week 18? The short answer is that week 18 is kind of a shit show, to be completely honest, to be blunt. Everyone is trying to make guesses and hedge on who's going to play, where snaps are going to go. Teams are resting. How much do you value a team that doesn't care? All this stuff. It's a very hard week to project, to be completely honest. I think Samaj P. Ryan was very chalky. Stanley Morgan might have been a guy that we were a little bit more on comparatively. Let's look. But I mean, the blunt answer is that it's just a very, very difficult week to project, and that kind of thing can happen. So I don't have a more satisfying answer than that. In the playoffs, teams have obviously, every team has the equivalent incentive to win. Every team is probably equally trying to win the game. It's a much easier week to project because you know approximately where usage is going to go. Teams are going to rely and play their best players. But week 18 is just always, historically week 17, always a very, very hard week to project. Okay, there you go. So yeah, Cincinnati, perfect example, right? A team that has no incentive to win. They were not trying to win the game. They sat almost all their starters, right? Where is that usage going to go? You are projecting players that you don't even know who's necessarily going to be on the field exactly, and you're projecting players that don't play very much and there's not a lot of data on. It's just a very, very difficult thing to project. So my guy John Sams, my like button, hype man, appreciate it, love that. Cool. Let's see. Let's keep it going. Still get some more questions here. Clint says, Jordan, wouldn't it be easier for them to just adjust their exposures if they're concerned with getting more diversity in their lineups? Yeah. Talking about the min uniques thing, I think, yes, that's fine, right? You just force more exposure in. The min uniques thing is really just kind of an easy way to just make sure that there is a baseline amount of diversification when comparing any two lineups together, right? I don't want two identical lineups in my pool of 20 that have one player different for one reason or another. I'm not saying I do, right? I'm hypothetically. And then you can just set that and just know it's taken care of. And even if you are well concentrated on still 2 to 3 different players, you know that the rest of the lineup is diversified around that. So again, not something I use, full disclosure, but we added it for a reason. It was a common request. We talked about it as a team, and I think it does have a place. So already answered this question about entry limit. That question came in Slack as well. Craig said, I noticed when you run your builds for the show, you don't adjust min salary. Are you actually okay leading up to 1,000 on the table in NBA, or do you just do this for speed in your example? I don't ever touch min salary. You'll see for NBA, unless you're playing like big 150 max contests, a lot of your lineups, especially those at the top of the range here, are not going to leave that much salary on the table, right? Unless it's a particular slate where some of the best projected plays, like if it is just one of those slates that's just horribly mispriced then it might be a situation where you get some lower salary builds. But, you see for a typical 20 max, something like the and one or the 4-point play, most of the lineups here at the top are not going to leave that much salary on the table. This is also a slate size thing. So when you get down to like a 6-game, a smaller slate, that min salary drops. On a larger slate, when we have like 11-game slates and things like that, you'll see that min salary comes up as high as 49.5. But you can just look at this 50, 50, 49.8, 50, 50, right? Like salary is very well correlated with both fantasy projections and actual scoring output in NBA. So the builder can kind of recognize that it's generally optimal to use almost all of the salary, and the best overall projected lineups use all of the salary. I'm curious, you can actually sort by salary, and we can see that the lowest salary lineup in our entire pool of 5,000 is actually right at the min salary line. One thing that can be interesting is to turn that min salary off and just see what the lowest overall salary is. In NBA, I found that it generally stays pretty close to the max salary, especially at the higher end of your SaberScores. In other sports, baseball, higher variance sports, hockey, even football a little bit, I will allow that to come down a little. And the builder will do that by default, but it's not something I've messed with in general. So perfectly fine to change it if you want. If you feel more comfortable with this at 49.5, then do it. I think in general, yeah. I think in general for NBA, I don't think you can really go wrong with increasing this. I don't think it's going to really cause any issues. I think on higher variance sports and sports where it's more important to kind of build a correlated lineup that has like an upside condition, even if it's not well projected on average, you want to be careful with that. But for NBA, I think it's perfectly fine, right? You can have a cheap like Pirates and Orioles stack in baseball, 5-3 stack with like 2 extremely low priced stacks with a very clear win condition that is leaving like 1,500 on the table, and eliminating those kinds of lineups sometimes can make it worse for you. But for basketball, I think it's fine to increase it. I just don't touch it. I think the lineups that I'm getting at the top most of the time are about where I want them anyway. So Derek says, when does it make sense to run a 1,000 or 1,500 pool size build versus the 500? Pretty simple, I would say, when you are making enough changes that you need some additional lineups, or if you have the time to do it. The reason it's 500 by default for most sports is because for the average user, based on our data, they are not making enough changes to exposure to justify the additional amount of time it takes to build 3 times as many lineups. They also is not a noticeable increase in quality of the lineups that you get at the top when you build anything, when you start building more than about 500 lineups at a time, right? So in other words, your 20 lineups, if you built with a pool size of 500, are approximately similar enough to a pool size of 1,500 that we don't think it's worth building the additional 1,000 lineups. But if you have the time, or if you're making the exposure changes, or you just want to know that you're building with a broader pool, go for it. So, yeah. Yeah, Williams got it. If you're planning on making a lot of changes post-build, makes sense to start with a higher number. I think that's true. So, and if I was playing more than 20 lineups, I would probably just build 1,500. Most of the time I do. Most of the time I think it's just, I've gotten in the habit of doing it, so I just build 1,500. With NBA, when you're right up against lock, if I'm playing multiple slates, right, there are NBA slates where news is breaking 10 minutes before lock, and I need to build lineups for the main, the turbo, a showdown, and maybe 2 sites. I'm not, at that point, I do not care about 1,500, right? I'm doing the 500, and I'm just rocking and rolling. But William said, is there any merit to lowering max salary as a rule for getting more unique lineups, or would that result in too much EV loss on average? It's a very good idea on sports and contest types where avoiding duplication is a core strategy, right? NFL Showdown, MMA are the 2 that really come to mind. Potentially golf and the right contest. But in general, you are likely going to find yourself playing a unique lineup on a typical NBA or NFL or MLB classic slate purely based on your sim variance alone. right? You're going to be diversified enough that it's unlikely that you get duplicated. And even if you do end up duplicated, it's not something that you could probably really reliably predict happening. And it doesn't end up, I actually think that's probably it. It's not something that I think you can reliably predict happening. In other words, reducing your maximum salary is probably not going to avoid that. On NFL Showdown, MMA, I think it is a great way to just kind of bluntly and blindly reduce the chance of any of your lineups being duplicated, because hand builders and traditional optimizers that are optimizing purely on packing as many average points as possible under the salary cap are almost always going to use as much salary cap as they can. Even though in these high variance contests like MMA and Showdown, NFL Showdown, there are plenty of lineups under that salary that have a high win equity for the contest. So I think it's a great idea. And in fact, you'll see that in Showdown, even for basketball, once your contest gets high enough, or once your size of your contest gets high enough that we think it makes sense to intentionally start thinking about duplication, the max salary actually comes down to $49.9. And this is kind of mostly just a flag of like, hey, think about max salary here. That's kind of what this is intended for. I drop this lower when I'm playing NFL Showdown. I typically leave it at about 49.5 for large field. For NBA, I would probably not move it beyond this. I think this is fine. But this is mostly intended to just be like, hey, this is something to think about. This is now useful. Whereas it virtually otherwise almost always should just be 50K. So. And then would you recommend lowering min salary in the case where the default build is set at 49 to 50K only? I would say most of the time I don't. The only situations where I do is if it is a very, very strange slate where there is a lot of extremely mispriced players. Like if there is, so when you look at the value, right, you get these slates every so often. First of all, this is an interesting slate tonight. There is not a lot of value on this slate. It's been a long time since I've said that, but this is an interesting slate. It's kind of a weird one. Like the best overall value play being projected for 6x here at 1 o'clock my time here. There's not a lot of places to go tonight, but anyway, the only situations I drop the min salary are when I think there are lineup constructions that are extremely low salary builds that are viable because of the way that the pricing is completely inefficient, right? So in an NBA slate, if there are like multiple guys with that 9x, 10x, 11x value, sometimes we get those slates at the end of the season, where I want to potentially have a build construction where I'm using multiple 3K guys that are projected for 35, 40 fantasy points because of the pricing inefficiencies, and include those in my lineups. But otherwise, it's not something that I really look at. Okay. Craig said, if I'm playing 20 to 50 lineups in the fadeaway, 150 max, in addition to 20 maxing the and 1 1/4 jukebox, do you suggest I run the build in the 150 max setting versus the 20 max setting if I just want to run one build? That's what I would do, personally. My approach is generally always that I would rather play lineups that are slightly more over leveraged, slightly over more contrarian than a little under contrarian. So like Craig says, in other words, is the 150 max setting too contrarian for the 20 max contests? Formally, yes. Theoretically, yes. But since you want to run one build, make sure you're playing a unique lineup everywhere, just have one build to manage, all things that I want to do too, I would just use the 150 max setting, because I would rather play lineups that have a little bit too much ownership fade and a little bit too much variance for the 20 max contests, rather than playing content lineups that are too chalky and not variant enough for the 150. That's my approach. I think it's also perfectly fine to just use sliders that are somewhere in the middle. I also think it would be perfectly fine if you said you just want to use the 20 max sliders. They're not going to create a fundamentally massive difference of your individual sliders between these two settings, right? You could also pick something that's kind of in between, but we're talking about the difference of sim variance 7 to 9. So it's not going to create an enormous difference in the lineup constructions between those two. I've done quite a bit of just anecdotal testing of the sliders myself, and something that I use is typically the only time that I really kind of think of like, okay, I might want to actually think about what sliders I'm using here is if I'm seeing a difference of 3 slider ticks in any direction on a particular slider. So like, for example, if I was comparing playing the 150 max fadeaway, right? 059, and trying to decide, would these lineups potentially be appropriate in my single entry that only has 500 people in it? That is a difference of 3 ownership fade ticks and what was it? 6 variance ticks. Yeah. To me, like, that's where it would be like, I might not have lineups that are perfectly appropriate to play in that other contest. That's kind of where I draw that line. But anything that is 3 ticks or less on any given slider, I think it's just close enough that I'm just willing to rock and roll with it, because I'm getting the benefit of having less builds to manage, a unique lineup across all of those contests and entries, right? I'm not just doing it because I want to, right? There's a benefit on the other side of it. So it's a trade-off. A lot of trade-offs in DFS. I find myself coming back to that frequently, answering questions here where someone asks something and I say, well, I do this because of the trade-off. We gain this benefit and sacrifice this thing. And I think that's a lot of the way the game ends up playing out. But okay. Anyway. What a stream today. That was a fun one. We talked about all kinds of stuff. I don't even know how to summarize. That was probably one of the better streams we've had recently, just in terms of all of the diversity of all of the different topics we talked about, all of the different things we covered. You guys kept me busy here for almost an hour and a half. So appreciate everybody that watched this, asked questions, participated. To all of you guys that watch this as a recording after, maybe on the way home from work, or as you are just winding down and relaxing in the evening, I appreciate you guys too. We will be right back here again tomorrow, same time, same place as always, 2 p.m. Eastern. So look forward to that. Good luck playing NBA, NHL. That's probably it. I think that's kind of what's out there right now. So if you're playing those contests tonight, good luck. If you are still waiting on news about the weekly max challenge stuff, free roll, 18-week prizes and everything, it's on our radar. We're working on it behind the scenes. We'll get it going here quickly. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, I will see you guys tomorrow. So take care. Good luck tonight. See ya.